A new front in Syria's war. Turkey launches air and ground attacks on US-backed Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. But what are the implications of Ankara's olive branch operation? And where does it leave relations with Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Inside Story began this year asking whether 2018 could see the end of the near 7-year-long war in Syria. Latest events would suggest the conflict is instead changing course. Turkey has launched airstrikes in the north as a direct response to the US decision to back a border security force in the region. The force, mostly made up of Kurdish troops who helped get rid of ISIL, would control this area of Syria. Neither Russia nor Syria are happy about the announcement, but Turkey feels particularly threatened. It has vowed to, quote unquote, strangle the force before it's even born. And it's with that aim that Turkey launched the offensive on Saturday, first targeting the city of Afrin. Turkish ground troops crossed into the district on Sunday after a night of airstrikes and artillery fire. Afrin is a stronghold for the Syrian Kurdish group, the YPG, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. That's because of its alleged ties to the PKK, a Kurdish group fighting for autonomy in Turkey. And Turkey's president says the next target will be Manbij, the Syrian city recaptured from ISIL in 2016 by a Kurdish-led force, also backed by the US but opposed by Turkey. Stephanie Decker has more from the Turkey-Syria border.
Shortly before sunset on Saturday, Turkey launched its air campaign on Afrin. Turkish officials had said all week that the operation was imminent. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke just a few hours before the jets took off.
We will wipe out this corridor step by step, starting from the west. Afrin operation has de facto started in the field. This will be followed by Manbij. Since the promises made about Manbij have not been kept so far, nobody can say anything when we do what is necessary.
Throughout the morning along Turkey's western border with Afrin, the Turkish army had brought in bulldozers, gravel and concrete blocks, appearing to build up their defences along the border wall with Syria. Tanks shelled specific locations on the mountain, and hours later this mountain would be targeted by airstrikes. The army made us move from this position a few hours before the campaign officially began.
This is just one of the locations that the Turkish army is shelling. Afrin is pretty much surrounded, Turkey to its west and north, and there's also been a build-up inside Syria by Free Syrian army fighters to the east of Afrin. Now, those are the rebels that Turkey supports.
Turkey had reinforced the FSA with thousands more men over the last few days. These buses drove the fighters across the border into Syria. They will be part of a ground offensive against the YPG, the Kurdish group Turkey considers to be a terrorist organization. It is also, however, the group the Americans consider their best ally in fighting ISIL. The international dimensions are vast. Russia announced it pulled out the few hundred military personnel it had in Afrin shortly after the campaign started. And Russia controls this airspace, meaning Turkey could not be flying their planes without Russia's consent. Turkey says it is only targeting what it calls terrorists, but there are already reports coming out of Afrin that civilians have been affected. It seems Syria's 7-year war is entering yet another phase. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, on the Turkey-Syria border.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Istanbul, Sinan Ulgen, chairman of the Center for Economic and Foreign Policy Studies. Idam in London, Gene Yildiz, a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and in Washington, D.C., Richard White, director at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Welcome to you all. Mr. Ulgen, I would like to ask you this. What is it that which Turkey aims to achieve at this cross-border operation?
Well, there is firstly a military objective and secondly a political objective. The military objective is to eliminate the influence of the Syrian PYD which is seen as the extension of the PKK, a terror organization, from this pocket of Afrin. And politically, Turkey wants to assert itself as a regional actor that will have influence in the medium term over the negotiations for a political settlement in Syria.
Okay, Mr. Yildiz, Mr. Ulgen has been talking about a military objective and a political one. Let's stay a little bit with the military aspect of this story, which is basically taking on the PYD in Afrin and Manbij. Are we talking about an isolated military operation that would end there when the PYD is evicted from both areas, or this is something that could further be extended to the northern east part of Syria?
Well, if you listen to the Turkish officials, the aim of this operation is declared as eliminating the power of the YPG across northern Syria. So they define it in a more broader way. But militarily, it's an extremely risky move. We can compare this against Turkish military's displayed performance in Al-Bab, for example, 2 years ago when they were carrying out an operation against the demoralized ISIS in a town which is way too smaller than, much smaller than Afrin in Al-Bab, and the operation took 3 months, and ISIS inflicted heavy casualties on Turkish soldiers at that time. And also we can compare, Turkish military capacity in the urban warfare, urban clashes inside Turkey against pro-PKK fighters at that time. And if you compare this with Afrin, which is a much less accessible territory compared to Al-Bab and a much larger area, and Turkey will be facing against a motivated, disciplined force which is well armed. And this area is actually a predominantly Kurdish area. So all these things will make the operation militarily very risky inside Syria, but also this can inflame the fighting inside Turkey between the PKK and Turkey, and PKK showed in the past that it can take a lot of risks to prevent Turkey from attacking Syria.
Mr. White, over the last 6 years of the conflict in Syria, the YPG, which is the military branch of the PYD, has been extending its influence from the northeastern part of Syria, from Kobani, Jazeera, all the way to Afrin, and their aim is to sort of link up all those 3 cantons, which Ankara considers to be a canton of terrorism. So are we talking about an isolated military operation, or do you think that Ankara is now determined this is going to be a very long military operation until the influence of the YPG and the PYD is undermined?
That's a great question, and we actually just don't know the answer. We've had a series of Turkish military operations against Kurdish forces in Iraq and now Syria. The Operation Eurasian Shield, which was the precursor of the current operation, lasted some time, but then the Turks withdrew. The challenge, and I like the way the first guest framed this as the most political and military dimension. The military objective will, of course, strongly influence how long Turkey stays there. So if Turkey can quickly defeat and drive off a lot of the Syrian Kurdish forces, and then the Syrian government moves in, and then they can withdraw. But the political issue is complicated in that Russia and the U.S. are not happy, but will limit the pressure they'll do to try and reverse this. But the Syrian government clearly would be very uncomfortable allowing a Turkish enclave in their northern border for any length of time. So this may be resolved quickly at the upcoming peace talks in Sochi or through Astana or Geneva, or if the Turkish government's willing to confront the Syrian government very strongly and perhaps hurt its relations with the United States and Russia, then they may decide it's worth staying in. And the Turkish government has shown a determination to ignore the pressure of other governments when it wants.
Mr. Ulgen, for the Turkish government to be able to advance its political agenda when it comes to this military operation, it needs to win the war as soon as possible. But you know that if they want to go to Manbij, they will have to move deeper, about 100 kilometers into Syria. When you go into an hostile environment, you're talking about massive risks for the Turkish military.
True, but I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, the target is the Afrin region, not the Manbij region. And even to carry out a military operation successfully across the Afrin region will require a degree of considerable risk and military commitment. So right now, the challenge for Turkey is to accelerate the success of this operation. Turkey does not want to be pulled in a quagmire, a bit like Israel was, for instance, when it did fight the Hezbollah. So the military objective of Turkish authorities is to carry this out as soon as possible. And this is what we see with the size of the operation. We're talking about an operation where more than 70 Turkish fighter planes are involved in a territory that is very limited. And I think the planning is that Turkish heavy artillery will be backing the Free Syrian Army as the main impetus, but eventually Turkish land forces may also be involved. So I think right now the target is the Afrin region, and Turkey will be all the more successful if international actors like the US and Russia actually convince the YPG to pull back from this region. And that's going to be quite important in determining how long the operation will last.
Mr. Yildiz, the YPG is backed by the United States of America. In fact, the US has armed personnel operating, training the YPG in that particular area. The Turks are very much aware about the situation. They've been very critical of the presence of the American troops on the border with Turkey. What has shifted the narrative now in Ankara from criticism into a military action?
I think we need to look at the developments in Idlib actually to really understand why it happened now, because this attack is not an offensive, is not a surprise. When I was in northern Syria like two months ago, this was the talk of the day with fighters and commanders and other people. They were all expecting such an offensive. But what happened in Idlib, I mean the Turkish offensive in northern Idlib against the radical elements there actually didn't end up the way Syrian regime or Russian forces wanted to see it, so that the Syrian regime now is moving into northern Idlib and pushing the rebels and other groups in that area. So Turkey saw that the window of opportunity for Turkey to trade something in Idlib against Afrin or to do some more activities inside Syria is actually closing down. So that's one factor explains why after 2 years of threatening for an offensive, why Turkey acted in this. But I think we need to bring in also the domestic political elements in Turkey in order to explain why this diplomatically very challenging, militarily very risky, and politically very problematic operation, why it is happening now. Because President Erdogan's AK Parti's alliance with right-wing political groups in Turkey, the far-right political parties and secularist nationalists, require this kind of offensive against the Kurds. And also it will help probably politically President Erdogan to galvanize and mobilize the masses behind him.
For the 2019 election. Mr. White, the Americans now face a challenge here. On one hand, they consider the YPG to be the most legitimate ally in the fight against ISIL in Syria. But at the same time, they cannot afford to further upset another regional ally in the region, which is Turkey. What are the options now for the Americans?
Yes, this has been a long-standing problem with the U.S. operations in both Iraq and more recently Syria. I wouldn't say that they consider the YPG the most legitimate. I think they consider them to be the most effective of the forces allied with the United States. I mean, as you know, because we've covered this in earlier programs, the U.S. tried for years to create its own separate military force. There was a lot of training, but that proved very ineffective. So what we have now is the YPG. And the reason why the U.S. is backing the YPG now is one, for military reasons, to make sure there's a force fighting the groups that the U.S. is most concerned about, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There's always a bit of concern that the Russian-Syrian government priority is not that. And two, if again, we're going to this military/political framework that was laid out in the opening question, I think that the political objectives of the United States are to make sure it have some say in the peace process. As long as there's a U.S.-backed force in Syria, then the Russian, Syrian, Iranian representatives involved in any kind of post-conflict scenario in Syria have to take the U.S. into account. The problem is that, as we know, the Turkish government is hypersensitive about the Kurds in Iraq and Syria and possibly Iran, although that's not been very high profile in recent years, because of its own Kurdish minority and the implications, concerns that if Kurds gain autonomy in one of these countries, then that's going to threaten Turkish autonomy. Now, I think one question, getting back to the question about why now, for the first, when Trump was elected, there was a lot of speculation that his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and other members of the administration would try and reach out to Erdogan, sacrifice the Kurds, turn over the people that the Turkish government wants to send back for trial that they claim were involved in the coup, and so on. But that quickly faded, and then there was a recent misstatement. It's a bit unclear what happened, but there was somehow got in the news that the U.S. was going to set up a 30,000-man border force made up of Kurds, and that seemed to provoke, right, and that appears to have provoked a lot of alarm in Ankara, even though the U.S. denied it. And I think that's where we are now. Now, going forward, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, the U.S. is, because of where it is now, isn't
the simmering discontent over U.S. role in that region has been going on for quite some time. I've been hearing over the last few months many statements coming from Ankara, basically lashing out at the United States of America. Mr. Ulgen, what are the options now for Turkey? Do you think that there's still a wiggle room for settlement with the United States of America about how to move forward, or do you think that the Turkish military and political establishment have made up their mind? They're going to continue the push, whatever it takes.
Well, I mean, Turkey will try to get both at the same time, in the sense that now there is the decision has been made in the Turkish government to start this military campaign. So Turkey will surely continue this military campaign until it is successfully concluded. But at the same time, the U.S. is Turkey's partner in NATO. The U.S. has influence in Syria. So there is a need to re-establish the grounds for having a more productive dialogue with the U.S. In particular, for Turkey to also solve its security challenges emanating from the instability in Syria, but also in Iraq. So I think Turkey will want to have those two at the same time, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Mr. Yildiz, there's another key player in Syria, Russia. It has recently pulled out its troops from Afrin. The only statement that emerged off the back of this military operation is a short one asking Turkey to show restraint. Is this a Russian way of saying, you know what, we have absolutely no problem with you continuing your operation against the Kurds?
Well, if you look at the Syrian map today, almost 1/3 of the territory is being controlled by Kurdish-led forces, SDF, and the rest is mostly controlled by the Syrian regime, which is the main ally of Russia on the ground. And Russia would want to, I mean, it makes sense for Russia to involve Turkey into in this equation, to put extra pressure on the Kurds, to make them maybe accept more concessions against the regime, such as maybe handing over some oil fields in Deir ez-Zor to the regime, or some Kurdish officials inside Syria actually said that Russia actually offered them or suggested that they should leave Afrin to the regime, hand over Afrin to the regime so that they can prevent Turkish offensive in the region, which wasn't allowed which wasn't accepted by the YPG. And another interesting thing is, like, the focus of the battle inside Syria has shifted very recently from ISIS to a power play between Russia and the US, and also an endgame in Syria. Now we have two main forces on the ground that would probably either fight or negotiate a settlement in Syria. And Russia wants to play,
I see your point.
Enforce his own ally, yes.
Mr. White, we're talking about three players with different agendas in Syria. Turkey, which supports the opposition and is keen about ensuring security on the border. Russia, which supports President Bashar al-Assad. The United States of America, which has been the main backer of the Kurds. Is there any concern that if the conflict continues, the potential for any confrontation between the three key players is very high?
No, I consider the actual risk of a direct conflict between the parties minimal. There may be another incident like the Turkish shooting down of a Russian airplane, although more likely the reverse of Russians shooting down a Turkish plane. But I think that would be managed. The problem we have in Syria is it's not just those three players. I could think, we could easily think of a dozen players that are all involved. The Syrian-Russian alliance is close, but Assad has his own agenda. The Iranian equation is very much of concern to the United States. It's less concern for Turkey, and Russia, he sees Iran, at least in Syria, as an ally. But there are differences. There's, of course, Israel's question. There's the Iraqi government's desire to secure the border, and so on. So they're just about it. And then there are the local combatants, the opposition forces, which are all divided. And it's easy for them to want to manipulate one of the big three powers we talked about. I mean, there's some that would like to have the Turks as involved to alienate further Washington from Ankara, divide the opposition. On the other hand, there are various groups that have different agendas. So this is a real mess, the whole Syrian problem.
Okay.
That's why the fighting continues.
Mr. Ulgen, France has asked for an emergency meeting at the United Nations Security Council, asking the Turks to stop the military operation. If the international sentiment goes against this military operation, will Ankara reconsider this move?
No, I think that Turkey is now ready to face whatever consequences international there may be until it decides on its own to end this operation. But we should also know that the start of the operation was conditional on some sort of agreement reached between Ankara and Russia, given that this is a region under Russian influence. So if this is going to be tabled at the UN Security Council, at least for the coming days, I would expect Moscow to back Ankara's agenda in some way or another. Now, things can change over time, but as things stand, I think the discussions at the UN Security Council are not likely to turn against Ankara.
Mr. Yildiz, this brings me to the question, which should be now the top priority for the international community, this conflict in the northern part of Syria or solving the Syrian conflict on its own?
I think the focus of the conflict now is slightly moving into this region, because if, as I said, SDF YPG is the second largest power on the ground. If they are weakened and if they are involved in battles against the Turkish state and pro-Turkish rebels in the region, then we might see other groups like that previously lost their power in Raqqa and other places can pop back up because of YPG's attention being focused on Turkey, so it can further destabilize the region. I think the main focus of the international community should be to mediate between the SDF, Turkey, Russia, and the US. I think Europe, which has become more like a less relevant actor in the fight, despite being bearing the brunt of the fighting in Syria with refugees and attacks in Europe, could play a significant role here by mediating between these forces because of actually their economic power, political leverage on Russia, Turkey and others. And Turkey and the Kurds are two potential allies of Europe in Syrian conflict.
Gentlemen, Sinan Ulgen, Güney Yildiz, Richard Weiss, thank you very much indeed for your contributions to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.